Hello, everyone. It's Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is August 30th. It's a Tuesday, 2022. And today's topic is understanding Reconstruction. Before we get started, let's click on the subscribe button in the lower right here if you'd like to subscribe to future episodes of Civil War Chat, and also click on the notification bell in the far upper right to be notified when those episodes are released. This will be part one of my discussion of understanding Reconstruction. Probably, I would say at this point, Reconstruction is the most misunderstood part of the Civil War and Reconstruction era that people are studying, and the current culture is being influenced by. In other words, the study of the Civil War and Reconstruction is currently influencing our politics, and to a major extent. And the biggest factor that is misunderstood is really Reconstruction. So I'll try and give you a quick summary of this. Reconstruction essentially breaks into three periods. The war ended, let's say, April 1865, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Some other armies were around afterwards, but April 1865 it ends. The first period of Reconstruction, there's three periods. The first period extends from there until about 2 years later in 1867, when the federal government passes the Reconstruction Acts, which will radically change how the South is governed. And that will launch the Carpetbagger era, which becomes the middle part of Reconstruction. That officially ends in 1877 with the inauguration of Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes. So that really did not end Reconstruction. It really just brought it into a new phase, which what I will say is the post-Carpetbagger era of Reconstruction. And that lasted until probably about 1950. It was not until 1950, for example, that the per capita income in the South, which was a below average percentile ranking in 1860, prior to the Civil War, its percentile ranking was about 73% of the national average. It wasn't until 1950 that the South recovered to that below average percentile ranking of 73%. And that was 90 years. So the Reconstruction era breaks into three periods. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the first period, which begins in April 1865 and ends in the spring of 1867. After Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became president. And in June, about 2 months after he became president, he began to lay the stipulations under which he would accept the reconstruction of the southern states into the Union so that they could rejoin the Union. Now, bear in mind that Lincoln had always maintained that the Confederate States had never left the Union. So reconstruction of the Union was a necessary part of the Republican Party's obligations, because Lincoln says they were never out of the Union. If they were never out of the Union, you got to readmit them. And that's what President Johnson finally decided that he wanted to do. For those of you that are not familiar, Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee. He was originally a Democrat, but the point is that he remained loyal to the Union throughout the entire Civil War. He was made provisional governor of Tennessee after the Union armies basically overran Tennessee. And during that period, his life was at risk. While Tennessee was fighting back and forth, we didn't really know which way it could go. His life was at risk. So a lot of people don't give him credit for that. But it was not it was a dangerous situation for him. Nonetheless, he decided in June of 1865 that he wanted to bring the states back into the government, just as into the Union, just as Lincoln had anticipated and contemplated. So he basically laid out three stipulations on the Confederate States for coming back into the Union. Number one, they must abolish slavery. Number two, they must repudiate all the debts that they incurred in support of the Confederacy. So all the debts, all the money that they put into Confederate bonds and that sort of thing, they just had to wipe it out and take the big loss on it. And number three is they had to rescind or repudiate their secession documents. And all of them did that. By December 1865, when Congress came back into session, Congress was not in session when Andrew Johnson became president. It would not come back into session until December of 1865. When that time came for the Congress to reconvene in December 1865, most of the Confederate states had run elections and returned their representatives to the Congress. Now, the important point here is that those elections in the southern states that resulted in those new congressmen and new senators that they wanted to install in Washington, the men that were elected were native Southerners. Some of them actually, served in the Confederate armies or in the Confederate government. The most notable example would have been Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, who was, I think, elected to the position of the Senate, Senate to be a senator from Georgia when the Congress reconvened in December of 1865. Well, of course, what happened is that by reading a reading of the Constitution said that Congress can decide whether or not members are acceptable, and through the work of through House Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, none of the men that were elected from the South were admitted. But it is important to note that in December 1865, the 13th Amendment passed. Eight former Confederate states voted to ratify that 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment ended slavery. So here's what you have. The 13th Amendment passes. It's ratified in December 1865. It was ratified when Georgia, which was the eighth Confederate state to approve the amendment, made that vote. That got the 3/4 of the states. When Georgia made that vote, that got 3/4 of the states to ratify the amendment, thereby making it, part of the Constitution. The legislatures of the Confederate states that ratified that amendment were composed entirely of white males. Native white male Southerners, almost 98, 99%. And many of them had served in the Confederacy. So that's a significant point. This was not, the ending of slavery with the 13th Amendment was not done by the carpetbag regimes. It was done by the legislatures that were elected in 1865, the same year when the Civil War ended, by Southerners themselves. This is an important point because it shows that Southerners really did want an end to slavery, even if it was a condition to get back into the Union. They really wanted it. Now, ultimately, what happened is that all of the 11 Confederate states voted to ratify the 13th Amendment ending slavery. It just so happens that when Georgia made its vote, it was the eighth Confederate state to do it. It was the last state that was needed to get the 3/4 majority minimum required to make the amendment part of the Constitution. But the rest of the Confederate states also came in and voted to ratify the 13th Amendment, ending slavery. Now, here's what's important. Now, to the best of my knowledge, not a single Black person was involved in any of those legislatures that voted to approve the 13th Amendment. None of the Confederate legislature, the states of the Confederacy in their legislatures, none of them had black members involved in that. So the process of ratifying the 13th Amendment was entirely done by white people, North and South. The process of ratifying the amendment that ended slavery was entirely done by white people, North and South. Now, that doesn't mean that blacks didn't, play their role. The 185,000 blacks that were part of the Union Army were there. That was about 5% of the black population, which was still not nearly as much of a commitment as was made by the Southerners to defend their region, which was 18% of the available population. But nonetheless, that's an important point. Now, when the men that were elected in those Southern elections for the representation in the national government as either congressmen or senators, when they arrived in Washington in December 1865 to take their seats, Congress, which was controlled by Republicans, refused to seat any of them. So even though they were elected, they were not allowed to take their seats in Congress. And it's important to note a second point. When the Southerners elected representatives for the Senate and the Congress in 1865, the voters were all white. The men that they elected were primarily men that had opposed secession originally. Alexander Stephens, for example, even though he became vice president of the Confederacy, he had vigorously opposed secession until his state, Georgia, didn't, went along with it. And then he, out of loyalty to his state, just as Robert E. Lee had loyalty to Virginia, went along with the Confederacy because of that. So that the men that were elected to the represent the South in the Congress, in both the House and the Senate, by Southerners were principally former Whigs, which were opposed to secession initially. So the reason that's important because it shows that the Southerners, after having lost the war, were understood that they had to make some changes, that they really didn't want to put men back in power who had advocated for the war. They wanted to put men in power in their states. They wanted men to represent their states who had not promoted secession, who had resisted secession. And the historians really don't give the white native Southerners credit for that, but that's an important point. So, okay, from April of 1865, when Lee surrenders, till the spring of 1867, the South has no representation in Congress, even though it voted to, it was crucial, the votes of the Southern states to ratify the 13th Amendment ending slavery. Now, when we get to 1867, the Republican Party has maneuvered to achieve their principal objective. Their greatest fear was that if the Southerners came back into the Congress, they could combine with the Northern Democrats to regain control of the federal government away from the Republicans. So the Republicans' top priority was to be sure that if the Southern states came back into the Union, they would not be voting Democrat. And that's what led to the 1867 Reconstruction Acts. The Reconstruction Acts were designed to create vassal puppet regimes in the South that would be controlled by Republicans. And that did, in fact, happen in 1868, just prior to the 1868 presidential election. All but 3 of the Confederate states were readmitted under these carpetbag regimes or under the provisions that resulted in carpetbag regimes. And as a result of that, the Republican presidential candidate, who was Ulysses Grant, won the presidential election. He had a decisive electoral college majority. But President Grant won only a minority of America's white voters, despite the fact that he was a national war hero for having been credited by many for winning the Civil War. He got only a minority of America's white voters. It was the black ex-slave vote that gave him the popular vote majority, which was 53 to 47. Without that, he would have had a minority. Now, so that leads into the second era of the Reconstruction period, which I will discuss in the next video. Meanwhile, you can get a lot of this information from my book, Southern Reconstruction by Philip Lee. I think it's a $26 book at Amazon. If you'd like to get an autographed copy from me, you can email me, Phil, Phil _Lee, LEIGH @me.com. In fact, a great deal of what I talked about is in this book, plus much more, because it covers all three periods of the Reconstruction era that I'm going to talk about. Now, just to give you a little highlight, one of the points that is often discussed in the press and in academia today is how sharecroppers were abused in the post-Civil War era. And they certainly were impoverished. But the important point to make that the academics do not make, or if they make it, they certainly don't, they just mentioned in passing, is that as late as 1940, half of all sharecroppers were white, not black. And secondly, white sharecroppers lived under economic conditions almost identical to black sharecroppers. Now, they certainly had a social advantage because of the racial attitudes of the time, but their economic status was extreme poverty. Both the black and white sharecroppers, as late as 1940, worked with tools that were hardly different from the Russian serfs of the 19th century. That's how long Reconstruction lasted. And I'll get into that in future episodes. But meanwhile, Southern Reconstruction by Philip Lee, available at Amazon for $26. Autographed copies from me available for $30 if you email me. Okay, that's our message for today, and thanks for watching.